Dry cured or fermented sausage has been around in some form for thousands of years. In fact, if you went back to southern Italy and looked at the Romans or Egypt, you would see them eating something really similar to what your granddad was making up to 60 years ago. I once had a professor tell me that the taste and the aroma we're looking for is actually a big, heavy, hairy dog who's been swimming in your pond and is now sitting on your porch in 100-degree heat trying to dry off. So it's a pretty powerful smell and taste. Then 60 or so years ago, the use of pre-packaged starter cultures became ubiquitous in the dry-cured sausage community. This all happened because of some advances in the freeze-dried technology. Freeze-drying is just turning the ice that's in a frozen product into vapor. Makes it so it stores for an incredibly long time and is very shelf stable. Now, one of, if not the most important concept in all of dry-cured sausage making is that bacteria hates acidity. A high acid environment destroys the cell walls of the bacteria and makes it so that it cannot reproduce. Now, in previous videos, we've talked about how under the right conditions, a single bacteria cell can become over 1 million in just about 8 hours. Does this by replicating itself every 20 minutes. So incredibly fast. Now, how are we going to render a product safe to eat without any thermal processing knowing that? Well, the answer is in dropping the pH of the sausage. Unlike when we're making snack sticks or summer sausage, we cannot do this with encapsulated citric acid. We have to use something called a lactic acid starter culture or lactic acid bacteria. Now, when we use these starter cultures, we have to do it within a set amount of time. These are called work hours. Think of work hours as your big project is due on Friday. If you don't submit the paperwork by then, everything you've done up until that point is all for naught. Well, it's the same thing. If we don't get our pH below our target pH, which is generally 5.3, within a set work hours, everything we've done is moot. The formula for calculating your work hours is actually fairly simple. You just take how many degrees the product sat over 60 degrees Fahrenheit and multiply that by the hours it took to reach your target pH. Now, anything that's under 90 degrees, we have a max 1,200 work hours. When we're talking about 90 to 100 degrees, we have a 1,000-hour max limit, and anything over 100 degrees, we have a 900-hour max. Now remember, that is the hours it took multiplied by how many degrees above 60 degrees Fahrenheit the product was sitting at. Now, before we go any further, we should talk about what pH actually is. It stands for the potential of hydrogen. Now, most people understand that the 7 on the pH scale is neutral. That's what water's at. The lower on the pH scale we go, the more acidic something is. The higher we go, the more alkaline or basic something is. Now, how does the measurement of something's potential of hydrogen actually make something more acidic, though? This is a difficult question. The best way to explain it is there's hydroxide and hydrogen ions in there. When we remove more of the hydroxide ions, which are basic, we are going to make something more acidic. These are also logarithmic scales, meaning a pH of something at 4 is 10 times more acidic than something at 5. It's then going to be 100 times more acidic than a pH of something at 6. So what's actually going on with that lactic acid starter culture? Well, it's going to start eating the sugars, specifically dextrose, in your product, and it's going to create lactic acid, which is going to lower the pH of the product, thus increasing its acidity. If we can get the pH to drop down fast enough below 5.3, we're going to end up with a product that is shelf stable and safe to eat. However, it's also almost certainly going to be sour and not something you want to eat. We can combat this with a drying phase. We're going to draw more moisture out of the product. Now, as we do this, this is where a lot of problems can pop up. Sausage dries from the inside out, meaning the moisture from the center of the sausage wants to get pushed to the outside of the sausage, where hopefully we're going to evaporate it off the outside of the sausage at the exact same rate as it's coming to the surface of the sausage. This means we have to be really careful with our relative humidity in whatever environment we're doing this in. If we have the relative humidity set too high, none of the moisture from the outside of the sausage is actually going to be able to evaporate up into the air. This can create mold, spoilage bacteria, all sorts of problems. You can even rot your sausage if you keep your relative humidity too high. If you put your relative humidity too low, however, you're going to dry the outside of the sausage too quickly. What's going to happen then is you'll form a ring of dried meat around the outside of the sausage, and none of this moisture from the inside can make it past that barrier. And again, we're going to get some rot or spoilage on the inside. Now, because of this, this is why we recommend that you use a dry curing cabinet to do this. I know your granddad did it in his basement in certain months of the year, and most of the time everything turned out fine. But these take a lot of effort. So it's much better to do it in an environment that you can fully control the relative humidity and the temperature of, and not just rely on whatever the weather is doing outside that day. Now, during this time, we want to lose anywhere between 25 and 50% of the sausage's total weight. I recommend that you weigh each individual sausage before you hang it instead of just doing a batch size, because occasionally we will have different sausages drying at different rates. Different lactic acid starter cultures are going to have different pH drops we're looking for within different time ranges, but the drying process has been somewhat standardized to anything between 54 and 66 degrees and 65% relative humidity. Some very popular dry cured sausages are sopressata. That's going to be something that's a slower process. It's going to be made out of mostly pork, sometimes a little bit beef. It's going to have larger particle size, and you're almost always going to use wine and garlic in that seasoning. Then we've got something like hard salami. Now, hard salami is also a slower process, but we're adding a lot of beef to that. It's a 50-50 mix. Sometimes it's mostly beef. It's going to give it a firmer texture. We're going to want smaller particle size, so we're going to do a finer grind on it, and it's going to have a firmer final texture. Then we've got one of my favorite things to make, which is Italian salami. Almost always going to be made out of all pork. It's going to have a slightly larger particle size. Again, it's a slower process, and often you're going to coat the outside in some form of beneficial mold. Then we have pepperoni. Now, this is a faster process. We're also going to have a really fine grind on this. You can use beef, pork, poultry, all sorts of things are used, and it's going to be heavily spiced. We're going to have paprika for sure, red pepper, and usually some form of anise. We've got a whole course on this stuff coming up for you. This is just the introduction. Next, we're going to talk about what type of casings you should be using when you're making your dry cured products.